Today on the MrMaple Show podcast, Matt and Tim discuss why you shouldn't name a Japanese maple.
Howdy, y'all, and welcome to the MrMaple Show. We've got a fun one for you today. Matt and Tim are going to be talking about why you should not name a Japanese maple.
Did you say why you should name a Japanese maple?
Why you should not.
I mean, we've named so many Japanese maples. How can we do that podcast?
Have we named so many Japanese maples, or is that a rumor?
We're going to dig into that, y'all. Y'all, we're MrMaple.com, that family mail order business. We ship directly to your door. Check us out on MrMaple.com.
Guys, we're going to be talking about the ins and outs of cultivar registration, evaluation, a little behind the scenes of what we do here, and talking to you about why everything doesn't need to be named in the world of Japanese maples.
So we often have someone who sends us photos of this pretty tree that's in their grandmother's yard, and they say, hey, I think I want to name this after my grandmother. And while that is a noble thing to name that after your father or your mother, it's hard to tell somebody no, but we don't need just another pretty Japanese maple. You need something that's distinctly different, and we'll get into that here in just a little bit.
So we go through a pretty rigorous evaluation process here at our nursery. We own MrMaple and Buckholtz Nursery. Both farms have introduced Japanese maples before. Talon's famous for introducing over 100 different Japanese maples. The guy's kind of the Michael Jordan of introductions. And I think people would look at his collection and deservingly so believe in the merits of it. You can look at what Talon Buckholtz has introduced, and you can see how it could be done ethically and right.
And that's the big point here is we have introduced and named and found numerous Japanese maple cultivars.
And collaborated quite a bit in introduction of maple cultivars.
But whenever it comes down to introducing a maple cultivar, it takes responsibility. I mean, and a lot of people are willy-nilly with introducing maple cultivars.
With great power comes great responsibility, Spider-Man.
It does. It does. And it's very true that there are many cultivars out there that if I saw it, it would be just another seedling that I wouldn't introduce. There's plenty of those that I look at and I'm like, there's already stuff out there like it. Why do we need another Japanese maple that's like this? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we're going to talk a little bit about our evaluation process and what we do when we find something that's special and different.
So we graft everything at the first point of evaluation. So if we're going to evaluate a tree for cultivar status, the first thing to do is to get it into production. So you need to graft that tree. They may perform differently on their own roots versus a graft. You may find that a tree on its own roots is a dwarf, but that's not true when you graft it and put some vigor into the tree. So the characteristics of what you're looking for may change greatly. So the very first thing to do is to get the tree on some good, healthy, we typically use Acer palmatum, subspecies palmatum, a green rootstock. But that's the first thing we do is we get it grafted. That way we can see if the plant is vigorous, if it's a wimp, what it's doing, and on a more standard nursery trial evaluation. Now, up front, we give everything a name. So we go ahead and put a cultivar name on anything that we're going to graft. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to get introduced into the trade. That doesn't mean that we've named this tree. In fact, many times we change those names. There's a lot of back house stuff you'll never see. We never put everything out there that we have a name on. That'd be ridiculous. So anything that we're evaluating, we go ahead and put a cultivar name on it. This works so much better than a code name. When we first started out doing this, we started using Nichols Nursery and then a numerical system. Very quickly, Tim and I got up to Nichols Nursery, 300-400. And we're talking like, this was in 2009. 2009, we already had 300 different seedlings we were evaluating for different characteristics. And a lot of those didn't make it. I mean, one of those from that set ever made it into anything we've done with. So most things don't turn out to be worthy of introduction. So there's a lot of duds. You have to go through you got to kiss a lot of frogs to get a good tree. And so I think a lot of people don't understand the evaluation process and the due diligence that goes into that. I had a guy, and he apologized for it later, but I had a guy who was kind of poo-pooing the idea of red Panda and, you can get these just as good from seed. And I wasn't trying to shut him down, but I said, look, man, I've went through 2,000 plus red Macawas since around 2008, 2009. So we're
not just
talking
Macawa seedlings. We're talking red Macawa.
just the reds evaluated that had the density. So we're not talking about, a small sample set here to get an evaluation. This isn't something we just went through a few things and found a few. You'll find a plethora of Japanese maple traits from seed. They all don't need to be introduced.
But I will say it's really important to put a name on a tree if you're grafting it to evaluate it. I know that, for instance, Nancy Vermeulen had one of her workers had found a red seedling under the original burgundy lace, and she named it Ryla's Red. And she was evaluating how it was different than red filigree lace. And it's a little more vigorous. It goes a little greener during the summer, but it's also easier to graft. And that's one of the knocks on red filigree lace, is that it's really difficult to produce and to graft because it doesn't produce good scion wood. And she was saying, I've got this code name Ryla's Red. Well, before she introduced it in the nursery trade, someone had came by and taken cuttings off of her tree and introduced it into the trade as Ryla's Red, even though she hadn't put a real cultivar name on it. It was more of a working name, so she would know exactly what that tree was. It later became Red Feathers. And
now we have both those duplicates out there in the trade, but at least Nancy Vermeulen knew where she was copied. And so there's at least an ethical standpoint of finding out where the Ryla's Red, she can set the record straight on that, where it's a lot harder if it's code 23148 and then they put a name on it, because you'll never know what it changed to.
Exactly. And that's what happens if you put a code name and it somehow gets out without your name. It ends up getting another name somewhere else, because no one's going to put out a code name like that. And then it gets out there with the name that you didn't choose.
And plus we need good cultivar names. So we don't want great trees with junky names. That does no service to the tree. So you don't want a tree. That's an example, a great tree. Acer Shirosawinum 6910, sometimes listed as Holland 6910. Great plant, but what favor did we do this tree with this name, right? This means nothing to anybody other than a collector who likes the traits and the beautiful habit of this tree. I could think of 1,000 more interesting, graceful names that describe that tree than 6910.
I know we get accused of putting marketing names on trees, and I say, why wouldn't you put a marketing name on a tree?
You want to make them boring?
Yeah, and sometimes people want to put too much into a name. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, we've often criticized the Dawn Redwood Daweswood Tawny Fleece because it got so long it barely fits on a label.
It's hard. You got to be conscious as a nurseryman that it needs to be something palatable. It needs to be something spellable. It needs to be something that, especially if you're putting it in English. I speak English, so I think it'd be weird if I named all my trees in Japanese personally. So I try to use my own native language. But you got to be careful. A lot of these trees, even when people have the best intentions, like Yukiyama, it ends up meaning something like snow pile. It doesn't mean anything.
And not even the way people would say a pile of snow.
Right. It doesn't mean anything. And so you've created a misnomer. It's interesting. But there's an ethical standpoint of that. And you want to give a valuable, good new cultivar a good new name that brings value to it. There's nothing worse than a great tree with a bad name.
So how do you know that you have something that is special and unique? Well, one, you need to understand what you're dealing with. You need to be in the community of Japanese maples to know what's already out there. Mm-hmm. You need to know that, this dwarf mutation I found is a dwarf mutation. This is a witch's broom. Or, this is just an irregular growth that's never going to amount to anything. It's unstable and it will never amount to, what we thought it was going to.
First off, is your tree already grafted? Are you trying to rename something? There are major corporations. Sean and I get a kick out of it. And I won't call it the major corporation, but you can go find trees sold at Ace Hardware right now that were found, in Minnesota in a garden. They didn't walk into the wild and find this lace leaf. It was already found in a garden and they just renamed it. So let's be real.
That YouTube video cracks me up. It's like, we found this in a garden.
Right.
Wait a second. So this was already a grafted cultivar.
Right.
So it got another name, got out there as this tree is exceptional, better than all the rest, but it was just another lace leaf that was unlabeled in someone's garden.
So we don't want to do that. We don't want to rename trees. You need to know if your tree was already a set of traits that's out there. If you have something that's very close to something that's already out there, it doesn't need to be reintroduced. That doesn't help anybody. There's a lot of Japanese maples. There's a lot of different debates on the actual numbers. Tim and I have probably... I don't know that we have this many now, but we've easily grown over 2,000 cultivars in our career now between MrMaple and Buckholz. And so we have a good understanding of what traits are out there, which ones are replicas, which ones don't need to be replicated. But we go through this vigorous process. Now, Tim and I call it our 5 and 7 rule. This is kind of our setup. We've set this in place from the very beginning of our collecting and our observation. And the main thing we do here is we compare this Japanese maple to the 5 closest things to it. So if we're going to introduce something, we want to be able to say what is the most like this cultivar. So, we've had 1,000 cultivars in our collection for many years, so it's pretty easy to go, let's sit down and evaluate what 5 things are closest to this. And we need to be able to explain how it's better and different than those traits. And if that process can't be passed by an expert Japanese maple person, you don't really need to move on to any further steps. If you can't name the 5 closest things to it and then why it's an improvement on that, you're already behind the gun.
And this isn't the 5 closest Japanese maples that you own. This is the 5 closest Japanese maples
in existence
that are closely related to it. That means you have to really dig into what's out there already. And if you do that, you start to realize, hey, this tree might not be as special as I thought until you evaluate it to understand how it may be different than what's already out there.
Hey, my crazy new thing looks just like Emerald Sunset. Well, then we probably don't need it if it looks exactly like Emerald Sunset that's been around longer. So we do the 5 and 7 rule. So the 5 rule is the closest 5 trees to that evaluation. That's our ethical step in trying to eliminate overlap of traits. And we need to be able to say it's distinctly better. Now, better could mean more vigorous. I'm not saying it can't be a better tree because it's more vigorous, stays more variegated. I mean, I've seen improvements on trees that were more variegated. We need it to truly improve what happens there.
That's a good example. For instance, Moonrise, to someone who was a layman, would look very similar to Autumn Moon.
And I don't think that any maple aficionado would not be able to see the merit and the difference.
Yeah, I mean, Moonrise, more vigorous, more colorful, more sun tolerant. There are a lot of characteristics that you can look in a tree to figure out how it distinguishes itself. Now, if it's less sun tolerant and less vigorous and it's a little more of a wimp, maybe it shouldn't be introduced.
Now, where does the 7 come in here? We have the 5 and 7 rule. So we're going to name the 5 closest things to it. Again, the very first thing we're going to do is graft it. Then we're going to evaluate those traits for 7 years. Now, we pick 7 years just to make a rule. And what we do here at Mr. Maple is we take those 7 years to evaluate it and to continue to compare it to that first 5 list. So we're going to continue to critique that tree for 7 years versus that first 5. Does it hold up? Is it good in sun? We're going to go through each set of characteristics and kind of evaluate that tree. And believe it or not, Tim and I are our own worst critics. People think we name a lot of trees. We've thrown more trees away than any nursery you've ever seen. And we've discontinued more trees that would be hits for a lot of people, to be frank with you, because they were too close to something out there.
And it's hard for many people because Japanese maples, even the worst cultivar of a Japanese maple is often better than many other trees. Mm-hmm. And so there's a cultivar like Acer Palmatum Volleyball that J.D. Vertrees pretty much trashes in his book. But it's a green Japanese maple with a red fall color. Then the fall color is pretty good on it. It's got a horrible name, Volleyball. That sounds like something really bad. But it's got good fall color, and people will say, oh, well, if that's a cultivar of a Japanese maple, why can't I name something? And it's important that it's unique, it's special, and it's different whenever it comes to this, because we do have a lot of cultivars already in existence. There's over 4,000 Japanese maples that are named. There's probably over 1,500 varieties that are in the United States. Mm-hmm. And we don't need another cultivar that looks just like another cultivar.
I'll give you a prime example here. At Mr. Maple, we found a Makawa Yetsubusa seedling that was very close to Mystic Makawa. We were grafting it. We were calling it Oompa Loompa. Out of respect to Crispin Silva, when we saw he was further along on Mystic Makawa, we discontinued all production of Oompa Loompa. He'd already had more, and out of respect, that means he was there first. He'd already had it in the marketplace, and we didn't want 2 trees with identical traits going on. And while those could be great as Makawa seedlings or even a graft of a Makawa seedling, they don't need a cultivar status. They don't need to be an exact replica that's 1-to-1, too close. Sometimes when Tim and I are comparing cultivars, we learned this from Ed Shin and some other older nurserymen, we'll create a Dansugi. We'll actually graft 2 trees that we want to see if they're too close together onto the same rootstock. So they're leafing out at the same time. They're going through the same characteristic changes in the fall. And, that way you can kind of compare them on their own like the 2 trees are actually on the same root system. And so, like I said, Tim and I are the biggest critics about stuff. So if something is too close to something else, There's zero reason to go forward.
Now, if you can't graft them onto different rootstocks or on the same rootstock to create that Dansugi Matt was talking about, one thing you can do is plant them in the exact same area. So you can take, one tree and plant it next to the other tree so you can actually compare them in similar environmental conditions.
And you have to be very careful of your own confirmation bias here. It's easy to go, well, I like mine better than his. Like, let's just use the Oompa Loompa and the Mystic. Well, I want to push mine out there. So his got hit by frost. Right? It's easy to confirm your own confirmation bias. But you have to throw all those things out in the evaluation process and truly evaluate what are the best traits. So it's easy to just go, well, mine's the best, and then come up with a reason why, but you've circumvented the whole process then.
So when we're going through this evaluation process, we grow the cultivar, the grafted selection we're evaluating. We grow that in sun. We grow that in shade. We grow that and figure out, does this tree perform better than other trees in the shade? Does it perform better than other trees in the sun? Is it a little more sun tolerant? Does it hold its color well in the shade? What's its shape? What's its habit? I mean, when you really start looking at these plants, they all have unique structures. And is its habit different? I mean, that is what we see the difference between lily pad and then something like Catalina Yatabusa. They have similar foliage and similar variegation on a Makawa sport, but completely different growth habits.
And this is a little more insider information than people may like, but we also need to know, is it a production plant? Is it going to be able to provide soundwood to actually be viable as a new plant? So if it can't be something people can make money on, is the honest answer. If you can't produce it, a lot of these Makawa types, we still produce them, but they're slow to produce. But if it's all going to be the tiniest growth rate ever, it's not going to be a hit.
Now, another thing we look at is the leaf shape. What is the leaf shape? How does this leaf shape different from the other cultivars that are out there that are maybe similar to this? That's one thing that's, I think, the old school people used to look at to like the billionth degree. And, some of those things like Dissectum nigrum and Red Select that have a different average number of sublobes, that's a little too much.
Right.
Like, I'm talking about, you look at the leaf and does it look different from what's already out there? We're not talking counting up all the leaves and the sublobes and averaging things out.
Right.
You want something that's special. And if it's not special to the eye, then it's probably not special to anybody else and shouldn't get a cultivar name.
Yeah, I completely agree. Now, we'll also compare some of those colors in the shade versus the sun and be critical of them in each. So are they holding their colors long-term in the shade? Are they holding their colors long-term in the sun? Spring, summer, and fall colors, those all need to be documented. Now, there can be some variations there each season. So you want to take out your own confirmation bias in that as well, because you're not just trying to push to put something out there. You have to criticize the plants and be open to other people's criticisms of them.
Now, one thing is important is its growth rate, its eventual size, its 10-year size. How does that compare to what's out there on the market? I mean, if you had a tree that looked just like Makawa Yatabusa, but then it got to be a 10-foot tree in 5 years, you would think you had a really cool tree. And it would be different than Makawa Yatabusa because it's more vigorous. But you just got to be careful to make sure that what you're looking at isn't, I grafted, this one was grafted onto a giant rootstock. This one was grafted to a small rootstock. You can go out there and get your own confirmation biases by sort of controlling how fast and how much you fertilize a plant as well.
Right. So you got to take out the confirmation bias in that. And a little bit of that is, if you're in this industry and you're evaluating cultivars, I highly recommend Tim and I'll give you a really ethical understanding of what we think. Like, I know Chris Adelet has a tree that he's really interested in. I'm going to graph that for him, compare it in some different environments. And that's something you can make friends with a nurseryman and go about if you're not in the nursery industry. If you are in the nursery industry, I heavily encourage you to make friends in some different climates. It's always great to have a friend in Texas, a friend in Oregon, a friend on the East Coast. And you can get these into some landscapes and get some actual notes on the differences over that 7-year period. Now, you got to trust somebody, because you don't want somebody to send your coolest new thing out there and flood the market with it ahead of time. But you want to make a community of people that you can trust, and they can give you, harsh notes. Well, it burned up this year. This year I had frost. But you need to take those things into consideration. It can't be that you had one tree in a garden and it didn't look good one year and it's a bad tree now. You have to kind of look at the overall picture, because you're going to get a different tree in Dallas than you're going to get in, Portland. I mean, it's just going to be a different growth environment completely.
So it's really important to send your evaluation to friends in different climates. So to see how these characteristics hold up in different environments. That is one really awesome way to sort of take out some of that confirmation bias, to be able to see this tree performing across the United States. And it's going to perform differently in different spots, but does it hold up to what you're looking for that cultivar?
And what's your target audience for this tree too? I mean, Japanese maples typically work zones 5 through 9. There's very little reason to be sending it to somebody in zone 3 or 5 or zone 10, unless you're trying, let's say 5, but 4, unless you're trying to confirm that tree is heat tolerant enough to go into zone 10. If that's the experiment, then yes. But if Japanese maples don't grow there, it's probably not going to look great there to begin with. So you kind of got to know your target objectives with this as well.
And it's really important to go through this evaluation process. For instance, Ken Twombly found a witch's broom on a red Japanese maple. And, our thought on a witch's broom would be, hey, I'm going to graft it. It's probably going to turn out something like Shayna. I mean, that would be our first line of thinking for a dwarf mutation happening on a Japanese maple, especially a red one. And then he grafted it, and it didn't grow just in a small little ball. It grew up to be a tall, narrow Japanese maple.
There are no definite rules when you're dealing with nature. It's interesting that, as soon as you say brooms are always going to be this way, you'll find something that breaks the exception. When you say that variegated sports are always going to do this, you'll break that exception. So you have to evaluate these things to really understand the nuances, and then really to get into that collector market, you kind of know what people are looking for. So it helps if you're developing trees that people actually want. We get accused of doing too many Makawa types. Well, I'm like, well, that's what everybody wants. You want to develop something that nobody wants.
Kryptonite, very awesome variegated Manusato style variegation on a Makawa Yatabusa style. And then you've got Red Panda, which is one of the best reds that I've ever seen on a Makawa Yatabusa. I mean, I think people are going to want these unique characteristics in the trade.
I guess people can get their own biases toward what they like and get tired of and things like that. But you really do need to find things that there's a market for, or there's really no point to it.
Now, one interesting evaluation process that Matt and I went through was when we were getting to introduce Acer palmatum Dragon Master. It was a weeping yellow Japanese maple. And we talked to Don Shadow, and he also had a weeping yellow Japanese maple. And we talked to Talon Buckles. Yeah, Talon Buckles also had a weeping yellow Japanese maple. So we actually traded with all of them, and we evaluated our trees against theirs. And, the first thought, someone would say, well, we only need one weeping yellow Japanese maple.
Can't have more than 2.
How many upright yellow Japanese maples are there?
It's interesting. And one of the ones I'll use as a great comparison with that is, I think one of the other champions is Golden Falls by Talon Buckholtz. We were the first nursery to get that outside of Buckholtz Nursery. Long before we purchased it, when we were just friends with Talon Buckholtz, he sent us some of the very first ones. And we used this in the evaluation process of Dragon Master. And we said, how different are these trees? How different are the leaf shapes? Let's take out our confirmation bias of saying they're both weeping. If these were both uprights, would they have a place in the trade? Well, Katsura is to Golden Falls as maybe something like Orange Dream is to Dragon Master. And those two trees are distinctly different in color and leaf size and texture and what they're bringing to the garden and fall color. And so you're getting a plethora of differences there. And that can kind of help you build on the success or the non-success. And so when we evaluated Dragon Master, there were lots of yellow Ryusans we had. There were several. There were a whole bunch of ones that just didn't make the cut for the final draw of what's the very best.
And during that process, we realized that Dragon Master was distinctly different than Golden Falls, and there was a place for both of those in the nursery trade. And it takes evaluating these trees, because if Dragon Master looked a lot more like Golden Falls, I would have said, okay, we don't need 2 of these.
Right.
I mean,
and to be fair, Tim and I, being younger nurserymen, we typically defer to our seniors on this. So if Talon Buckholtz said something that was too close to what I did, out of respect, I'd probably bow out, just like I did with Crispin with the Mystic Makawa. Out of respect, I didn't want to bring something to the table too close to what he had. So that typically Tim and I's mode of operation is, it's already out there. What's the numbers on it? That's better. Let's discontinue our section here.
Now, Red Panda took a long process of going through lots of red Makawas. I mean, literally, when you talk about the best red macawas, we went through over 2,000 of the best red macawa seedlings.
There were years where we collected 25 pounds of Macawa Yatsubusa seed. It's been a passion of mine and Tim's since 2008. We started this process in 2008 of trying to find our best red Macawa. We officially sold the tree for the first time in 2023, so that should give you an idea of how long it took us to find what we were satisfied with. And that meant collecting all the red Macawa forms we could find. It meant collecting all the red Macawa seedlings from years that we could get our hands on. If we went to a nursery and they had Macawa seedlings, we bought all the reds they had, and we put them into our evaluation process. If we went to Talon Buckholtz and he had red Macawa seedlings, we got every single one we could afford to get, and we put them into our evaluation process. It happened to be a seedling that we collected here that became the eventual red Panda. The color, the texture, everything about it, the vigor, it just stood out to us. I actually ended up naming the tree because I was out with my kids. A lot of times I'll end up putting a lot of the names on some of our collections, and a lot of times it has a hidden meaning to me. Well, we were at the WNC Nature Center, and I was just having the best day ever with my children, and they had a new red panda exhibit. And so it just kind of reminds me about time with my kids and family time. And so we were there, my kids were just oohing and on at these red pandas, and I had this red seedling that had really been the apple of my eye on the collection for a while, and we said, Tim, I think I got something for this one.
And one of our first evaluations that we really went through a rigorous evaluation process was Acerala veranum Hot Blonde. And this was a seedling that Matt spotted in our greenhouses. We'd collected this seed from Chapel Hill, and we grew it out, the seed set. And Matt walked by it one day in the greenhouse and said, Tim, I think that one's a little more yellow than the rest.
I think we're on to something here. And there were about 10 of them that had more chartreuse to yellow characteristics, but there was this one distinct winner right out the gate.
And then when we started to evaluate this tree outside, you really started to get more and more of that yellow color. And that's when it really shined for us, was this tree thrives and does phenomenal in the heat and gets more yellow in the sunlight.
So we got it grafted early on. We started trading it around. You know, we had great feedback from guys like Talon Buckholtz. He's somebody I used to send stuff to before he ever worked for us. And Talon's a harsh critic. If he thinks something sucks, he'll tell you.
We sent it to Brian Sherman at Pages Run.
Brian Sherman was adamant that we should patent this plant. So a lot of encouragement from Brian Sherman up there at Ackerboom, Pages Run Nursery on eBay, good friend of ours. And he gave us a lot of detailed notes on this. And Brian's assessment was you should patent this. Brian's assessment was you've got a game changer for Japanese maples here. And Talon Buckholtz basically said the same thing. He didn't say patent it, but he said it's one of the best fall colors I've ever seen. The vigor's through the roof. This is, you're onto something here, guys.
He was sending me photos of the fall color, just astounded by how good of a fall color it had. Mm-hmm. And when you're evaluating fall color, you've got to watch out for certain things. I mean, the original tree in the ground, the original seedling in the ground, a big specimen is always going to have good fall color. What does a 1 gallon do? What does a 3 gallon do? Mm-hmm. And he was like, this thing is rocking it out in the greenhouses in fall color. It's really something special.
And it's good to have friends like that, like Brian Sherman and Talon Buckholtz, that you trust their opinions too. So when those guys tell you, no, this is a good one, you believe them because they'll tell you this is not a good one as well. I mean, Talon, if you send him something and he's not great, he'll tell you, I think this is a dud.
Yeah. And with Hot Blonde, it leafed out 2 weeks later than many other Japanese maples. So it avoided the late frost that we often get here in the South, which is a beneficial aspect. And it could handle full sun, and now we know they can handle full sun in Texas. I mean, that is what we're looking for when we're introducing something. We're looking for something that expands what people can do with Japanese maples. We're looking for something that allows people, especially in new climates, to be able to enjoy Japanese maples like they've never been able to enjoy Japanese maples before.
Yeah, Tim and I, you got to be a hard critic when you do this, but you got to be plugged into the maple community a little bit. Be willing to send, if you can't send trees to somebody, send pictures. So I know back in the day, I would send Yano-san pictures of trees. I would send Cor Van Gelderen pictures of trees. I would get their feedback. You know, if I didn't send them the actual tree, I would send them some pictures of it and say, does this catch your eye? Is this interesting to you? Does this help? Is this moving the ball forward? What do you think about this? And so, having a whole community of people that can help regulate you so that you don't just become your own egomaniac either. So you're not just like, I've named 700 trees and every one of mine are the greatest. And you look at them and you're like, yeah. I mean, to be honest, people think Tim and I have put up a lot of trees. From trees we've evaluated here from seed and then placed names on. And again, I've been doing this since 2008. My dad's been doing this for over 50 years this year. For over 50 years, we've been Nichols Nursery / MrMaple now as a Japanese maple business for 50 years, this year specifically. My grandmother was growing Japanese maples 20 years before that from seeds. So my grandmother started growing Japanese maples in the 50s. So we've went through a lot of seeds here. There's a lot of seedlings around from grandma's collection. I live in the house she built in 54 with my grandfather, the house Hicks Hill built. And so we've been around a lot of seedlings for over 50 years of some of these evaluations and seeds. I think Tim and I put names on 15 trees so far. And I like that we actually grew from seed here in our collection. Now, part of why the reason Tim and I get accused of putting too many out there is we do make other people's trees famous. So like people will send us trees that we didn't name here, and Tim and I will champion them if we like them. You know, a great example of something like that's English lace. Jerry Childs sent us English lace very early on. He found out about us here on the East Coast. He said, these guys have got 1,500 cultivars. This is who I want to help me take notes. And so we do that for a lot of nurseries and for a lot of independent collectors who think, I've got a great tree. Let's see if it's, worth its weight. Let's send it. And so we will do that process for people. So we actually received 2 different trees from Jerry Childs. One was English Lace 1 and one was English Lace 2. And we evaluated the 2 for many years and took notes for him. And then only the best one became English Lace.
And y'all, we've been doing this for quite a while, and because we've been evaluating trees and we have so many trees to evaluate, many people send us cuttings of their new introductions so that we can help in that evaluation process. For instance, we were part of the introduction of Pink Princess, and we actually even got to put the name on it. But this was a witch's broom that was found by Carl Munn, the same person that found Moonrise. Mm-hmm. And he said, guys, this isn't really my market. My market's larger trees. This is probably going to fit your collector market better. Grow this and see how this does. And
what a unicorn. It's to date the only broom on a variegated cultivar I can tell you about. If that doesn't scream cultivar uniqueness, I don't know what does. A 5x5 Benny Shishihinga in 20 years, that's super unique. And so stuff like that gets through the evaluation process because it came to us through different means. So there's a lot of times where people will come to us and they'll have something that, is already a little bit more established. Like a good example of that is Kristen Starr. Bill and Kristen Taylor came to us. I've known them, pretty much my whole career. They started shopping with us really early on. They were shopping with Dad probably before I even started to help take over the business. And Bill and Kristen Taylor had Kristen Starr, a seedling they had very mature in their garden. A seedling, by the time I saw it, was well over 10 years old, very well established in their landscape. And Bill's a very knowledgeable guy on Japanese maples. And so he already had detailed notes on how this tree's grown for him. There was a lot of the due diligence was already done at that point. And so you can expedite the process somewhat if you trust the process that's already been established in someone's work. So we did help get Kristen Starr into the trade, though I didn't name it or find it myself.
And sometimes when that happens, these go into our Area 51 collection, but that doesn't mean that it's a tree that we personally found. And sometimes even with some things like Chica, it's not something that we personally named either.
Right. That actually originates from Japan from a friend. So sometimes Tim and I will champion things we find very cool and that, they're originals here at our nursery as far as mass production and getting them out into the trade, but they're not trees that necessarily we named and evaluated. We did evaluate them or we wouldn't have put them in the trade. If I didn't like it, I wouldn't graft it. But somebody brought them to us and said, a great example is Bart Eichelman's. He's come up with a ton of cool stuff. Marielle, long-term treasurer of the Maple Society. He's come up with a lot of great plants over the years, and I've really benefited from him sending in some neat things to me over the years to graft.
I thought you were going to say Marielle, a long-term treasurer of the Maple Society, because she has been. She was the treasurer under Matt and when he was the president, and the treasurer under me when I was the president as well.
She's still the treasurer.
And she has been an integral part of the Maple Society forever, a good friend, and her and Bart have a beautiful garden and some amazing selections.
At some point we're going to get up there and film that garden. Whew.
Yeah.
So another example of how a cultivar could come to us would be something like Firefly. We've talked about this one's origin story a bit. Firefly was a misnomer in the trade. It had a nonsensical cultivar name on it that was already a duplicate name because somebody didn't do their due diligence when they found this amazing plant. They didn't know there was already a cultivar out there named Moonfire. So I purchased this tree. I bought what became Firefly. I started to do the homework on it. I started to try to compare it. My Tim and I's philosophy was that something was wrong here, and we need to identify what this cultivar was because it clearly wasn't Moonfire.
We thought it was a mislabeled tree.
Yeah, so we started comparing it to the 5 closest things to it by reverse. And over time, we realized this didn't look like anything else that we have in our collection. And we talked to the guy who had originally received it from the guy who found it. He said, guys, he thought Moonfire was an original name. So we need to change that if that's already out there. So this got introduced as Firefly, a little bit in reverse, but the evaluation process had already been done. Our friend that I purchased this tree from had been growing Japanese maples for 50 years. He was a contemporary of Talon Buckholz's. And so all the work had been done.
And that's the real thing you have to do with naming a cultivar. Why you shouldn't name a Japanese maple is if you don't want to put in the work behind it. And if you don't want to get an answer that says no, which happens a lot, more times than not, you get the answer, no, this shouldn't be a Japanese maple. If you can't take that answer, you probably shouldn't be trying to name a Japanese maple.
I will say, not everybody's going to find the best stuff. I mean, sometimes people are like, how do Matt and Tim come up with all this stuff? We say no to more things than we ever name. So just because you see all this flashy stuff at Buckholz or at MrMaple, it doesn't mean that every single one of those is going to make it to a cultivar status. They're still going through the process. We let a lot of people in early on that process because we love the nursery industry. We love giving you behind the scenes. So you'll see things early on, like say Agape or even Pandemonium, things like that. Those are not registered cultivars. They're not cultivars that have made it to the trade yet. They may, but we love bringing you guys in early and kind of showing you some of our projects and just what we love. So like if there's something we're really excited about, I'm going to share it with you guys on our channel just because that's what we love doing. That's what we're passionate about. But it doesn't mean that every single one of those will always make it to full cultivar status either.
Now, I've heard a lot of people, and this is just sort of the talk that starts happening when people start talking about how many maple cultivars there are, because there are, close to 4,000 cultivars worldwide, about 1,500 different varieties in the United States. People say Japanese maples are starting to be like hosta and daylilies. And that, when you look at hostas and daylilies, there are thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of those cultivars. I mean, more than I've seen in any other, type of plant. Hostas and daylilies probably have more variety than anywhere else. And it's because they've become popular. It's because people find a seedling in their garden and they say, hey, this is neat and this is different from what I have. Mm-hmm. And I think what we have to do is be responsible and say, is this different from what you have, or is this different from what is out there?
Right.
Which are two completely different things.
I think there's a lot of different ways to go about this. Talon Buckholz says now a lot of times he lets the market decide. He'll come out with a great cultivar, something like Nebula, and everybody's snatching it up. So he knows this one's really popular, so he'll keep producing more Nebula, and then he'll continue the things on that are successful. But I don't think anybody would look at Talon Buckholz 50 plus years of cultivar evaluation, starting with Fairy Hair, through the Ghost series. People are going to look at these and they're going to say that's a collection that's worthwhile. There's a reason why there's so much preservation going on there. With Bartlett even wanting to make sure they have every one of his collection, with everybody wanting to kind of obtain some of these gems that he named. There's an ethical way of going about having amazing new plants. I'm sure somebody in the 1700s said, hey guys, we got the 1700s list. Do we really need another one? And that doesn't mean that it's done. I mean, like somebody looked at Akashigatatsu Sawa and was like, do we really need a purple ghost? And I think that you can fall into that category as well too. And I'll also be a little devil's advocate toward naming new plants. Sometimes people just find great stuff. I kind of look at great hit plants like great hit songs. Some bands are one hit wonders. Talon Buckholz is the Beatles and the Eagles. That guy just put out more hits than anybody. So there's valuable things out there for those looking, but they have to do it the right way.
And it takes an evaluation process. And I think some of that where people start saying it's like hostas and daylilies starts to be that, they don't have room in their garden anymore for any more Japanese maples. And if they don't have any room in their garden, that means there shouldn't be any more ever introduced.
I do think there's a certain stage where people do get a little bit that way. It's like, you especially if you spend a lifetime collecting, I know customers, and it's easy to get into this category. It's easy to be that critical of anything new. And it's easy to be like this way about plants overseas, for example. So say you can't get it because you have a confirmation bias because it's in Belgium or it's in say the tree you like and you saw this tree is in Holland. Well, we don't need another one like that. Right. So that can happen too. And I know Tim and I are kind of cutting edge and we're always pushing the envelope on new introductions, but there is a confirmation bias toward, I already have 300. There can't be another one because I've collected and I have everything that there is now. And so no one else gets to introduce anything new. You know, I've heard all the music there is. We don't need any new songs. It's kind of the same mentality. There's always room for new songs if they're good songs, right?
And that's what we're saying here. We don't need a governing body that regulates what people are trying to introduce in the trade. We need people to be responsible and realize you need to go through this process. You need to evaluate what's out there. And we need to make sure that what you're introducing is worth introducing. Because just because you can take a good photo of a red Japanese maple doesn't mean that it's different than another red Japanese maple that's already in the nursery trade.
Yeah, you got to be careful there too. I mean, there's so many great plants out there. You want to really make sure you do your due diligence and you're comparing this to everything out there. And then when it meets those criteria, you want to be conscious of that. You're doing the tree justice. Like you got to come up with a good name for a good tree. There is a litany of work out there. So you need to be familiar with that work. You need to be getting all the Japanese maple books. You need to be scrolling through websites. You need to be going on MrMaple. You need to go, does this look like this? And how does this grow? Do I need to go purchase this from another nursery and evaluate it against that? Do I need to go buy this tree just to make sure that this tree is distinctly different than what I'm trying to introduce? Because you got to do a lot of due diligence there. And if the due diligence isn't done, you're going to come out with a lesser product.
Now, once you've done all this work, you can actually register through the International Maple Society. I think Alan Tabler is currently the registrar for the Maple Society. They often will have, it's down currently, but they often have a way you can register on the Maple Society website. Right now, you can just do that through emailing Alan Tabler. But it's important to register your name. And what we're doing with that registration with the Maple Society is confirming that name isn't doubling up something that's already out there.
You need to be careful. There's a lot of people, like a perfect example is a tree we recently offered here on MrMaple that we didn't name. Anybody's new things people think are us. And so it's funny because I'll offer someone's new introduction like Pink Panther and somebody will say, hey, put another one out there. But for instance, one time I'll put up a seedling and I'll say, if you were going to name this seedling, what would you call it? I bet you 50 people put Pink Panther under the seedling. So a lot of people were thinking very similarly about that. So you need to make sure that you've studied and done your homework on what names are out there for Japanese maples so that you're not getting too close to that. A good example is Tim and I named Hot Chicken, which is a goofy, funny name, I know. It's part of our Heat Seeker series. It's an Acer livianum. Originally, we wanted to call it tree Hot Wings. There's an Acer tardicum that's called Hot Wings. I do not want to put another Acer out there under a similar name. I think it's unethical. It'll lead to more confusion. And I think both have a good place in the market, not against either of them. I love our tree, and I wanted to give it something distinctly different, so I didn't place a name too close to what was out there. But that took a lot of homework to find everything out there. It used to be a little easier when Peter Gregory and Hugh Angus were updating the World Maple Checklist. The Maple Society is moving toward a system where you can have a better checklist. I know we're going to build something here on MrMaple where you can eventually build your own cultivar list from our website and kind of look at what's out there. And that'll help some folks too, because at least you'll be able to see all the registered names and all the appropriate cultivar names that we have here, so you can kind of evaluate that against it. Now, if you're not looking at all those names out there, it's very easy for somebody to come out with the exact same plant name as something that already exists.
And that's the main thing about registering. It's not getting permission to introduce a tree, because if you've done your homework and you know that it's truly different, there's no one else that has done that homework to tell you that it's not.
Right, and I'll never take the power. I'm always against taking the power out of the nurseryman's hands. The nurseryman's, in my mind, I've studied so many great men, from Carl Munn to Talon Buchholz to Jano-san to, Dick Vandermatt, for example. Dick Vandermatt's named so many great plants, and all these guys have mentored Tim and I in some way. Elizabeth Mundy. All these people have had such an impact on us, and I would never want to regulate those artists. Like, to me, those are the painters. Like, those are the guys out there creating cool things. They've contributed to what I do infinitely. They've given me a source of income. They've given me cool plants to produce. And I don't want to be one. I never want to see a regulating body be a couple of guys who aren't as knowledgeable as, say, Carl Munn or Dick Vandermeer. I never want to see two guys in a room going, "Yeah, I don't like it." You know, there's already a
when you have a governing body, then what it does is it becomes political,
right.
And then you start getting politics based on, I like this nursery better than that nursery.
Well, this nursery contributes to the fund of this, or, you know, whatever. So it can easily get that way. You know, a good example would be something like Firefly. Like, say two guys have only seen pictures of Firefly in a room in late summer or something. They're sitting around going,
we've already got first ghost.
Yeah, there's a ghost out there. We need more ghost looking trees. And like, they haven't really grown or interacted with the plant. Tim and I have tried to write books with people before, and we joked around. We started doing a book. We started doing Japanese maples for the South with Tom Cox, one of our late great friends, Tom Cox. And the confirmation bias was hard because Tom would go, "Well, I grew one of those and it didn't grow well, so I didn't like it." Well, you got to put it in different environments, because if you're looking at one in one garden, and you can't say the whole cultivar didn't turn out okay just because
you planted a spot
you had one that didn't go well. You know, say there was something wrong with your tree had an insect issue or something completely unrelated to why that tree should be a great plant.
And it's important to take all criticisms and everything about your plant and really be able to evaluate it without your own bias, and be able to evaluate and say, is this tree worth introducing? How is it different? How does this tree stand out from what's out there? And that's how I want my gardens to look. I want my gardens to look with trees that are different and stand out in different ways. If they all look the same, it gets kind of boring.
Mark Weatherden has the best close to all of his emails. We've interviewed Mark Weatherden on the channel. He's the curator of the JCRA. He's the director there. Mark always says life's too short for boring plants, and I couldn't agree more. So the last thing we want as nurserymen is something ho-hum. We don't want something that's going to come out and not make a splash. We do this for a living. If it ain't cool, our kids don't get to eat. That's basically the bottom line. If we don't come out with something interesting and we're putting stuff out there that looks like waterfall, what the heck's the point in that? It's not going to sell. First off, the market's not going to respond to a dud. Like, they're not going to buy remarketed garbage. Like, people want cool plants. And so for us, it's always trying to improve what we do, come up with the very best things. We do stay cutting edge here, but not every Japanese maple should be named. And so we did this podcast because we want to kind of give you some insight into our process. We wanted to explain to you a little bit of what we're thinking behind things. There are some different nomenclature rules too. There is the ICRA, which is the International Cultivar Registration Authority. They have a few different rules in the Maple Society. So you'll see sometimes people will tell you, well, a tree can't be two languages. And there may be some different biases on that. One of the common rules is you can't use Latin anymore. So they don't want any more Latin names. We've used Latin for so long, we don't need any more Ariums. Like, please, no more Ariums in the trade, right? It's hard enough to pull orders when there's 18 Arium, different cultivars here at our nursery.
Arium, Glauca.
Different species, yeah. So we don't want that either. We want trees that are distinctly different, that add to what we do and improve the overall trade.
And the ICRA, that's actually the authority that actually gives the Maple Society the authority to actually have their own individual registration process. And if you've got a new cultivar, you've done through this evaluation process, and it has been a success, that's when you contact the Maple Society. Currently, it's through Alan Tabler, but I'm sure in not too long, they'll probably have that feature back up and running on the Maple Society website.
And it's easy to criticize. Like, I'll see introductions that come in now, like several of the newest ones registered. I'm like, that's too close to this, this, and this. But I will always be against nurserymen being over-regulated, because I think at the end of the day, this is how they feed their families. And you'd hate to... What happens back in the day if somebody says, well, we just don't like this moonrise. This purple ghost just doesn't do it for me. This amber ghost is too close to Shigetatsu Sawa or Akashigetatsu Sawa. You know, those are the kind of things that burn me up, and you don't want to see, you know, beautiful trees and what we do be underappreciated either. So, don't name every single Japanese maple. But if you go through these steps, if you take it responsibly, and also, if you're a customer of ours, don't be afraid to reach out to Tim and I for advice. We care passionately about these things. I care, people blame us sometimes for naming too many trees. And like I said, Matt and Tim don't name that many trees. Like for the years I've been doing this, we're not doing one a year.
As many trees as we've seen between traveling to Japan, Oregon, Texas, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, as we're traveling across the country and around the world, Europe, we are seeing these trees in so many different ways, getting opportunities to have, witches' brooms that we see on trees because we're traveling on so many trees. We have more opportunities to find those seedlings when we're collecting seeds all around the world that are special and different from what's already out there. And that's what we're asking that you do when you're going to find and trying to figure out if you've got a Japanese maple that can be named or not.
I will say to our critics, I'll put our collection up against what they've introduced. I have come up with some good ones. I will tell you that.
Hot Blonde, Dragon Master, Red Panda,
hits.
Kryptonite.
There's some good ones out there. So do your process, be your own worst critic, care about what you're doing. Don't put out garbage. It's not a cash grab, because at the end of the day, if you put out something that is the same thing, it's not going to cash grab at all. Like, you could rename Shiranami tomorrow. No one's going to buy it because the next guy's going to have Shiranami. So it's not a cash grab to rename things. It's junk, and it happens in our trade. But at the end of the day, people find the best stuff. And there's a reason why our new things sell out. It's because people want them. It's not that they don't want them. They're good cultivars. They're good introductions. So do the due diligence. Everything doesn't need a name, clearly. That's why we named it this podcast. But if you're doing things ethically in the right way, there's a lot of room for improvement. I think there'll always be new art. There'll always be new music. There should always be new Japanese maples. Like, does anybody go like, I've tasted all the good foods? This is what I love. This is my passion. I get fired up about it, but I get tired. I do get tired of people saying there shouldn't be any new ones. Like, that bugs me equally as much, because like Jimi Hendrix was great. I love Jimi Hendrix, but you don't want to hear somebody else play guitar sometime. Like, you want to hear a new song? Like, let's hear something new too. Like, this is wonderful. Like, wow, I didn't know people could do this. I think it's the human spirit that creates new things. And, it's God that gives us all these great plants. So I also love Talon's quote that he's never bred a single plant. He did breed his children, but he never bred a single plant. He just observed them and then gave them names. Because at the end of the day, we didn't create any of this. God did. We just get to kind of tell you what it is and pretend to call it a name, but it really is its own thing.
Y'all, thanks for jumping in today's podcast of why you shouldn't name a Japanese maple. I hope you enjoyed understanding our evaluation process and what we go through. And if you're doing this and you're looking at possibly naming a plant, hopefully you'll go through this same process.
And again, I'll make another plug, guys. Reach out to us. We'll be glad to give you our undivided attention. Tim and I love this. We're passionate about this. If you have an introduction that you want to make, send us some pictures to MrMapleQuestions@gmail.com. Tim and I will take time. We'll look at it. We'll tell you what we think. We'll give you an honest opinion. We love doing this. We found great plants from people sending us things before to evaluate. We do it for other nurseries. We do it for collectors. I've mentioned a few, but it's a process we absolutely love doing. And we're passionate about getting it right, not just putting out numbers.
Take care.
God bless.
And have a great day.